Welcome to Thriller Talk. Luke McCallin was born in England, but he grew up in Africa and was educated across the globe, working with the UN as a humanitarian relief worker and a peacekeeper. In his novels, he explores what happens to normal people put under abnormal pressures, and this led to a historical mystery series built around an unlikely protagonist, Gregor Reinhardt, a German intelligence officer and a former Berlin detective chased out of the police by the Nazis. He lives in an old farmhouse in France in the Jura Mountains. Luke, welcome to Thriller Talk.
It's great to be here. Good. How are you?
Fantastic. We're pleased to have you today, and there's so many interesting topics I'd like to talk to you about. But first, as we just talked about before we jumped on, you lived in Africa and many other countries. How do you
Yep.
feel your travel experience has affected and influenced your writing?
I think I'm still figuring that out, to be very honest. But I mean, one of the ways it's affected me, I mean, as an observer, should we say, everywhere I go, I try my best to integrate, to be part of the society that's, in many ways welcomed me into their midst. But you'll always have somewhat of an outsider status, and I think that gives you a really interesting opportunity to observe people, just see how things work and move and sound and feel, and what you can do and can't do, and what's changing around you. So, and then you get exposed to all these different cultures of storytelling. I mean, growing up in Africa, that was certainly a big part of the oral tradition. The people around us, it just stories come differently. They're told differently, to different pace, different rhythms. So you absorb some of that too. And then, but I think it's mostly been my professional career as an aid worker where I've really started to, take what I'm seeing, take what I'm doing, take what I'm sometimes not doing or not able to do, and start to fold that into my writing and think, oh, how could things be different, or how could I observe this and sort of try to be truthful to what I'm seeing and give you what I hope is a really authentic taste of some pretty interesting places around the world, and at the same time a sort of rip-roaring thriller whodunit, all sort of wrapped up in the center.
Well, I'm sure in some cases the truth is stranger than fiction, and you probably couldn't write about some of the things that have actually happened because people may not believe that. Is that true, or?
Yeah, that's pretty true. Either that or the ethics committee of my organization would sort of, either first tell me not to write it and then run down the corridor with their hair on fire, saying, we can't possibly have this person publish this. But yeah, there is, and that sort of leads me sort of tangentially onto another point, which is, I love Gregor Reinhardt. He's got a lot of miles left in him. The treads on his tires are still pretty good. But more and more, I'm really inspired to try and write, thrillers set in the aid world. I call them, for want of a better word, humanitarian thrillers. And when I think about some of the places that we work in, some of the issues we're faced with, some of the people we must deal with, that does take some believing. What we come up against. It's in Bosnia, for instance. I was once staffing a little reading library in a city in the Serb part of Bosnia. I turned around and I came face to face with a war criminal, indicted for all kinds of war crimes. And he was there perusing through the human rights literature. And he looked up at me, he gave me this sort of, if I can say it to your listeners, this sort of shit-eating grin, and then just walked out. He knew exactly what he was doing. So, little things like that, little vignettes like that. Watching what happened in Afghanistan recently with the evacuations, I thought, what an unbelievably fertile ground for a thriller. I mean, you could just think what you couldn't do with that stuff. Warlords and women in distress and aid workers and
Oh yeah.
politics and the military and Kabul, and what a setting for the airport, and the wrong person gets on the plane, or does they, or do they, and someone's got to be looked for in the city, and possibilities are endless.
Yeah, that's brilliant, and I agree with you completely. So, what makes Sarajevo such a fascinating setting for your novels? What is it about that area that kind of really captured your imagination?
So Sarajevo was a city I came to know and love, actually. Lived there for 4 years. We were in Bosnia for 6 years with my family, in Sarajevo for 4. And it really is the most extraordinary mosaic of a city, right? It's this sort of smorgasbord, sort of mashed together jumble of, prehistory, very ancient, prehistoric presence in Sarajevo. But more particularly, there's this Ottoman, the Ottoman Empire absorbed what becomes Bosnia much later in history. The Ottoman Empire takes us over, and Sarajevo becomes key sort of transit point, key military hub, key governing hub. Sarajevo comes from the old Ottoman word for a caravanserai, which is literally a campground where the caravans would stop for the night and lager up, and then gradually around these campsites, more permanent structures come into play, and thus Ottoman Sarajevo was born. And then many centuries later, the Austrians rock up and decide they want a piece of that action. And so Sarajevo is an Ottoman old city on the sort of the far western end. And literally you walk out of the old Ottoman city and you're on the old road to Constantinople. You kept going that way for a few weeks, and if all goes well, you rock up on the Bosphorus and you're in Constantinople. And you go out the city the other way and you keep walking, a bit of a diversion through mountains, whatever, and you end up in Vienna. So you get the city sort of like a torn between these two imperial capitals, and it reflects itself in the architecture and the customs, in the mores, in the way the city was governed. So the Austrians come in and they set up this extraordinary sort of straight boulevard, sort of Regency imperial buildings that are 4 or 5 stories tall, and then the Ottoman old city is these sort of beautiful old part brick, part wooden houses, old Turkish style mosques and minarets, and the old markets there and cobbled streets. And then the Austrians thought, oh, that's all very old, we should have something new. And so there's always this little sort of contestation in the city. It's not the only city in Sarajevo like that, but it's the capital, so that's where it all really happens. And then, over time, the First World War, the Second World War, the most recent Balkan War, it's, amongst other things, it's a contested concept. The city itself is a contested concept. And one of the things you want to try and do in historical fiction is one of the first characters that you have to make people believe is real is the setting, right? It's the place. It's Berlin, in the ashes of Berlin, or the divided city in the States, or even some of our great thriller compares, Michael Connelly, it's LA. LA is a character, right? Yeah. New York is a character. Chicago is a character for some of your thriller writers. Well, Sarajevo is a character for me too. And Sarajevo is a contested place. People want to fight over it. People don't agree what it's about. Not everyone can agree who lives in it. And then, I was there for those 4 amazing years working, but also made many friends. I spent a lot of time in the city, observed the people around it. And the best way to describe it to you is a mosaic, right? It's the most beautiful mosaic, piece by piece. It's accreted over time, and it's a beautiful city, beautiful setting. Mountains come right down into it. River runs right the way through it. It's very peaceful, very tranquil. I can't recommend it as a destination more highly. In fact, one of the best, actually was the best review or comment I ever got from a reader for The Man from Berlin was someone reached out to me on the website and said that they went to Sarajevo and they took The Man from Berlin with them and they used it as a travel guide. So I thought, job done.
Yes,
that was pretty good.
And so, do you go back to revisit certain places and refamiliarize yourself, or is it something that you just know so well since you've lived there for so long?
Yeah, we went back once actually, in a couple of years after we left to see some friends, and it was funny how it changed so fast. Really, it felt very different. It felt I'm not quite sure what it was, but it wasn't quite the city that I knew, and in a way that was normal. It was. Even when we were there, sometimes you would blink and a building that had been destroyed in the war was repaired or fully demolished. Towers were going up, buildings were going up, roads are being repaved, you name it. But it still felt quite different. No, the real sort of my knowledge and love of the city really came from living there, and that's what I've sort of passed into the first 2 Reinhardt novels, so The Man from Berlin and The Pale House, and that was really a case of you, the reader, take me by the hand, close your eyes, and I will take you. Trust me, I will lead you down these cobbled paths and down the rushing river and into the mountains and stuff. And I know what I'm doing here because I lived it and breathed it and loved it. And I hope at the end of the novels, those first 2 novels, the readers too.
Yeah, I can see you have an intense passion for history, which I really respect, and research for that matter. What is it about the World War II time period that really attracts you, intrigues you?
So it was, history has always been, I guess my first love, my first academic love. I devour it, I always have done. And then over time, you settle upon certain parts, certain periods of time that are more interesting to you than others. And for me, it's what I've always loved is these sort of, I call them crux points in human history, where things are everything's up in the air for grabs, and no one quite knows whether the world's going to go that way or this way. And you feel, things are moving beneath the surface, not always beneath the surface, sometimes in full view. But you feel that something's going on, right? And no one quite knows what's going to happen at the end. And there are those who try and take control of those moments, and then there are those that just live them and try and endure them. And then there are many that don't survive them. So, revolutions have always been very interesting to me. The French Revolution, the original one, and then the two that took place subsequently in the 19th century. Then the Russian Revolution. I was a student of Russian history, and I lived in Russia for a bit. It was going to these places was, trying to understand, or seeing how these places give you new understanding of history was always fascinating. And then the two world wars, quite clearly, are, just you couldn't get more. The pieces of the world are shattered and chucked down, and then it's a race to see what comes out of it next. So it's not so much the wars, not so much the campaigns or the who did what to whom, although that is also fascinating. It's much more the human experience in times like those. Like, how do you survive it? How do you live it? How do you endure it? How do you manipulate it? And then I sort of flipped that on to some of the work that I was doing in Bosnia at the time. I was a political officer for a UN peacekeeping mission. So my job was really to get to know the country as well as possible, so that I could let my UN colleagues know who had other duties. Essentially, that I was their political eyes and ears, and I was there to sort of help them make sense of what was going on. And so you again begin to match that sort of academic history, the dates, the places, the times, the who's, the where's, that kind of thing, and you match it onto like it really happened there, and that really took place over there, and people just like them were either slaughtered or survived or fled to the hills or came back down from the hills as partisans or collaborated, and then you start to wonder, okay, well, what would it have been like for this particular person? Or as I was living that sort of experience in Bosnia, I was in many ways an occupier, right? I was part of an occupying force. Certainly we were blue helmeted and we were benevolent, or at least we tried to be. But I nevertheless moved through Bosnia in a way untouched. I was untouchable, and I thought that was a really interesting perspective to try to bring to something like a wartime story. Gregor Reinhardt, in many ways, as an occupying German soldier, would have been untouchable. Certainly, he would have had a target on him. People could have killed him; they would have. But nevertheless, no citizen of that country could have touched him. He could have done almost anything, gone almost anywhere. And so, matching my experience or what that kind of feels like, and all that love of history and trying to sort of merge it all together, was really, really passionate. And then just, I flipped that on its head for the third novel, The Divided City, because from being an occupier, Reinhardt is now the occupied. And, he's back in Berlin, shattered in ruins, and he's under occupation. And on a few occasions when I was in Bosnia, I observed quite closely my Bosnian colleagues, and I tried to understand, how do I seem to them, right? How does this all seem to them? This is their country, but they don't really run it. This is their land, but they don't really own it. How would I feel in their shoes? So those are all the sort of little building blocks going on, if that makes sense at all.
No, 100%. And it's absolutely fascinating how you chose that. So what made you choose Gregor specifically, for your protagonist? Because as you said, it's kind of an unlikely choice, which I love because it's fresh, and interesting.
So I would like to say, actually, I should say, Gregor chose me, right? So the story that I've told, and it's a true story, is he just walked into a dream one night. And he had this sort of, if you can imagine it, this sort of Humphrey Bogart noir sort of look, raincoat turned up, fedora. There was a cigarette smoking somewhere, and he said, basically, my name is Gregor Reinhardt, and I am on the edge of despair at what my life has become. And then I woke up and with this very vivid image of him in my mind, and I scrabbled around to try and figure out, what just happened, who was that, nudged my wife, did you hear that? Or did I dream that? Wrote him down on a bit of paper. And then he kind of waited for me to tell his story for the longest time. And I was really confused in many ways, enthused and confused, because no one was more surprised than me to find myself channeling a middle-aged German from the 1940s. So I always thought I would, we all writers say they were born to write. Of course, I'm no exception to the rule, but I always thought I would write science fiction and fantasy. I still hope to do that, right? But all of a sudden, Gregor Reinhardt, bang, there he is. And for the longest time, I was trying to figure out, tentatively approaching him, shying away from him. I was really worked up by what does it say about me that I've just channeled, a German cop and soldier from World War II. I mean, people are going to think that I'm a Nazi. Gregor Reinhardt's not a Nazi, but these things get conflated really easily in people's minds. And then I began to get all hot and bothered about the research, and I ran away from it. Initially, Reinhardt was supposed to be set in Berlin, a city I knew nothing about. I hadn't visited it. And then all of a sudden, I had this sort of road to Damascus moment, sort of, the sun shone out from behind the clouds. And I realized what I was actually doing was, I think now, I was essentially channeling ways of dealing with, what I was seeing and working on and doing and feeling in Bosnia. And I was channeling them into him. And essentially, I was basically writing my story through him, things that I would like to have done, or things I think I would like to have been strong enough to do had I lived those times. Because I wasn't always strong enough to do what necessarily always needed to be done in my work, right? None of us are. But when we're dealing with, politics and human rights and, stitching a country back after a war, if you're not strong or don't hold to your principles, then, sometimes things can happen that, can have bad outcomes for people. So I was essentially channeling it all into him. And I realized that so much of what I was seeing and saying and doing could be flipped backwards to the Second World War. And all of a sudden there was this amazingly fertile ground, and the story wrote itself within months after having, gestated, in fits and starts and bursts and everything over basically 10 years. I dreamt in 10 years before I finally put the last full stop on the novel. And I had no idea what I had done. I just thought I had written something interesting that I liked, but I had no clue that it was a novel. And here we are.
That's amazing. Wow. And that's generally not the way it works.
So I'm told.
But I love that. So given your, work in the UN, which is incredibly important, and writing your novels, what would you say is the proudest moment of your career, your total career, where you've been doing many different things?
So like a professional achievement. Mm-hmm. That's a really good question, actually. So I'll give you one example of something that I left feeling very proud of, and it wasn't Bosnia. It was when I was working in Africa, and we were working in Mali, and I was working as a United Nations volunteer for a UN agency. And long story short, we were repatriating people back to Mali from a war that had taken place in the early 90s. And the people we were bringing back were Tuaregs, so essentially nomads. But they're nomadic around certain zones, certain areas, sort of oases or villages or certain sort of hutments where they can go off for weeks and months at a time, and then they circle back to this place. But in the time that they had been away and in the area where they used to live, other people had come to live there, and by the Malian government, well-meaning, had encouraged these people to sort of do tree planting, reforestation, climate change. Even back then, especially back then, we were on the front lines of it. We were talking about the age of the Sahara Desert was coming south further and further every year. Tree planting was a big way to sort of stem that tide. The first thing the Tuaregs do when they arrive back in their old areas is start chopping down trees because they wanted to build houses with them, or the frames of houses. And so all of a sudden, right away off the get-go, there's potential for conflict between the local inhabitants and these returning people. And we were caught in the middle of it. And then by pure happenstance, I found out that there was an Italian organization that was offering to train people to build houses without wood. And I went to see them, and they were these extraordinary sort of beehive structures. They were sort of igloo-like, and they were, by virtue, don't know why, don't ask me, but by virtue of their construction, they were also naturally air-conditioned. They were amazing. And you could make them modular, and you could sort of build one and then knock a hole through and build another one. And so I ran back to these Tuaregs and said to the chieftain, give me like 2 or 3 of your guys to come and learn how to build these houses. They all laughed at me, saying, houses without wood? Never be done. Never will be done. And I said, no, we can do it. So I took 3 of them, these guys with me, and I took 3 guys from the local sort of community, and I handed them over to these Italians and said, teach them how to build these houses. And these three that learn how to build it can teach, each one can teach 3 more, and so on. So the cascade effect. And after much suspicion and much hemming and hawing and backing and forthing, finally, like 6 trained masons went back to the Tuareg encampment, and they began building these houses without wood. And it just calmed everything down. Everyone relaxed. Everyone, and it was a way of making a bit of money for these people. They were, people began, making the bricks, and then there was the whole technique to be done, and then sure enough, so I left thereafter. I left what seemed to be a fairly idyllic situation, and I was very, very proud of it. And it was a simple, small thing in a way.
Wow.
Right place, right time, right people. The anecdote, the end of the story is, from time to time, I would, any of your viewers remember Google Earth, before we had Google Maps, we had Google Earth and the sort of lovely globe. And from time to time, I would check it out. I would just check the dates of the last satellite parts of Mali. Sure enough, I could see them. There were these little clusters of round houses. But then in, what was it, 2000, and I don't remember when there was the uprising, the Islamist uprising, and the French intervention, 2013, I think. I checked, and they were all gone. They were destroyed, or else the people had left. They fled. And if you don't live there and maintain these houses, it doesn't take very long for the desert to reclaim them. So they're gone now. But
Wow.
that was a small little sort of not high politics, not sort of riding in on a white jeep, not this, not that. It was basically convincing a Tuareg chieftain that you could build a house without stone, wood. Give me 3 of you young guys, and I'll show you we can do it. And it calmed, made their return back, simple, kept forests planted, kept everyone happy. So there we go.
That's a fantastic story. And it really is true. Like, I think sometimes the simpler things are so magnified, right? When like you teach someone something that is going to keep the whole society going, like you said, I think that's absolutely brilliant. I love that. Now, when I have people on, we love to ask about their publishing story. So now you kind of, you know, basically told us that the book wrote itself, and all of a sudden you realized you had a novel on your hand. But where did you go from there? How did you sign in with an agent and get the call that you were going to be published?
Yeah. So I'd done everything backwards. So I would like to say, I would like to put like a sort of a warning: do not do what I did, if you can at all avoid it. So there I am, sort of struggling away with this novel, and I've, in my mind, it's fully plotted, right? I've got it all the way to the end, and it's about 2/3, 3/4 written. And at that point, I said, okay, stop, pause. Let's get some proper, validation on this thing, because of course, my family all loves it. Of course they do. Friends will love it. Of course they do. But I mean, I want, other eyes on this thing. So I literally Google writers' workshops, and the first hit I get is this workshop in New York City. I'm going to pronounce it wrong. The Algonquian workshop.
Yes, Algonquin, yeah, yeah.
The Algonquin. There we go. And I sort of basically signed up for it. And one of the things they asked for was a very detailed synopsis, which helped. So I brought all that together and popped it off. And I got, accepted in, and I bought a plane ticket and flew all the way to New York, very excited. And I realized what I'd done was I thought I had signed up for a writing workshop. In fact, what I signed up for was a pitch the agent workshop. So I arrive in New York with this sort of, metaphorical half-finished manuscript under my arm. And I had what I thought was a pretty good pitch. In fact, it was a good pitch. I pitched to 4 agents, and 3 of them liked it. Tom bought it.
Wow.
And I said to him, it's not finished. He said, yeah, no problem. Write me an email when it's done. And I couldn't believe that anyone would operate that way, because in my line of work, if it's not done yesterday, 5 minutes ago, then you're in deep trouble. Right. And no one's going to remember. No one's going to remember you, a year from now. But sure enough, the 3 agents, the 3 editors who said they wanted it, all responded. One had left the business and gone on, and one said it finally wasn't quite her cup of tea. And Tom sort of, leapt right in and said, I love it. Where's the second one? And I said, is this where I tell him it took 10 years to write, or not? So I kept politically stum on that one, and I said, of course, Tom, I will deliver you a second manuscript. And I did, actually. But that's another story. So there I am. I go back to Bosnia, and I go, full of beans, sort of saying people like my book. And then I finished it, off it goes. And then, Penguin Random House, with Berkeley, I think, they write back and say, we love it. Here's a 2-book contract. By the way, do you have an agent? And I said, what? And and so I then had to find an agent, and that was, I must have gone through all of it, 4 people, generally before I found an agent. Um, so my writing, my publication sort of story is just like, falling backwards out of a tree and landing on my feet or on a trampoline or something. It's been nothing but good luck and wonderful people along the way to sort of help me. And then I got Peter Ruby is my agent with Peter Ruby, and it's all been just smooth sailing from then. First 2-book contract, and then second 2-book contract, and that's From a Dark Horizon is the fourth one, and that one now they're waiting. Tom, if you're watching, I swear I am almost done with the synopsis for the fifth one. It is coming, but they seem really happy and they want more. And not only do they want more of Reinhardt, but they want happy to look at whatever else I want to write. So that's where I come back to sort of circling the block a bit on those humanitarian thrillers and trying to figure out, well, how can I make them work? Both professionally and also as thrillers.
Yeah, I would be first in line to buy one. I can tell you that. Sounds fascinating.
Tom, you heard that?
Yeah, there you go. There's at least one sale. And many more. So with respect to advice that you'd give yourself, like if you could go rewind time and, when you just had started writing, what would you give yourself with respect to advice?
I would probably say be kind to yourself. I think I beat myself up an awful lot. And I think part of that was what I said, right? It was to do with the topic, right? It was like, oh my God, what does it say about me? I'm writing in German. But in fact, I realized I was sure he is a German. And I guess for a good reason, it makes you sit up and want to pay attention. And not only that, but he's a German in Sarajevo. Where's Sarajevo? Oh yeah, really interesting part of the world, that. So they're all hooks, if you like. But ultimately, I realized I was writing like a human, I guess a universal experience, like one man against the machine, if you like.
Sure.
So I would say be kind. I would be kind to myself. I don't know whether I would say being kind will take you 10 years. I think that would probably have been a bit frightening, that I would have embarked on a project quite that long. The other ones didn't take that long, for sure. But and it would also be trust yourself. I think one of the things that happened when I first began thinking seriously about this character and what he meant, what he implied, was I kind of set up, like I said, my go-to genre to read was science fiction, fantasy. It was Stephen Donaldson, it was Tolkien, it was Neil Stevenson, it was William Gibson. I didn't know the first thing about historical crime fiction. I had read a lot of historical fiction. My dad and my mum and I are big fans of that genre. It goes all the way from medieval history. My mum loves the Brother Cadfael histories. I don't know whether you know those, about a medieval monk who solves crime back in medieval England, and then all the way through to things like the Patrick O'Brian seafaring series or the Richard Sharp adventures, and so everything in between. But crime fiction had not been a genre that I really engaged with. And so I began to look around and say, well, what does this mean? Like, what does it look like? And I stumbled across by accident Philip Kerr's Berlin Noir trilogy. And I basically killed my writing stone dead for a couple of years, because I thought it was brilliant. It is brilliant. It's just a fantastic trilogy. But it was set in the lead up to the Second World War, and it was a Berlin private detective. And I thought Philip Kerr had mastered that sort of problem about how you make your character likable, because I was struggling with how can you possibly make a German from that era likable. Well, he made his character likable by making him a private eye and being annoying to everyone, and always having like a sort of a double entendre or a quick joke or quip. And so in a way, Bernie Gunther, Philip Kerr's character, he's outside the system looking in, right? He's not in it. And I thought that could never be bettered. But then eventually, after a couple of years of doing nothing, I came back to it. And I thought, and then I realized I have other things to say. And what broke me of that feeling of inferiority or feeling of I can't better that was when I finally got The Man from Berlin done, and it was almost out. Philip Kerr's Lady from Zagreb was published, and it's set in large part in the Balkans. And I leapt and devoured it, and I came away feeling very confident that Bernie Gunther and Philip Kerr own the sidewalks of Berlin, but the Balkans is mine. it's my turf, and I felt really confident about it. And since then, I've just been, I doffed my hat and I bow to the giants of the genre. Like I wish I could have met him before he passed. It was a couple of years ago, and just told him how much I admired him. But it was I'm not quite. I'm sort of. I think I've drifted very far away from your question. Is any of this making sense?
100%. No, it's really fascinating, actually. So, talking about the giants of the industry, who are some of your favorite authors?
So, in any genre, or in particularly in this genre?
Any genre, really. I mean, just who really inspires you?
So, I really, I really like the Lee Child series, Jack Reacher, for all kinds of reasons. One of them for the sense of them being unstructured. Some of them are first person, some of them are third person. Sometimes you never quite know where it is in time. And also this sort of sense of this you open a Jack Reacher novel and it's like that ball just starts rolling. It doesn't let up. And so I learned a lot about pacing and plot, and
Mhm.
just how to keep a page turning. So Lee Child, definitely a huge influence on me. Philip Kerr, clearly. Um, I'm going to get this guy's name wrong. The Martin Cruz Smith, Gorky
Yes.
Park.
Mhm.
The Arkady Renko series about the private detective writing in private detective working. Not even private detective, a cop in Soviet Russia. But where I differ from Martin Cruz Smith and in a way Philip Kerr is, I find that their protagonists are set in these amazing locations, and you really want to okay, what am I going to learn about Soviet Russia? What am I going to learn about Nazi Germany through their eyes? But at a certain point, it stops becoming believable, right? There's how many high-ranking Nazis can Bernie Gunther piss off before they just turn around and have him shot? How deep can Arkady Renko investigate in communist Russia before he's put in a gulag? And I was really conscious with Reinhardt that he had to be believable within the system. So, but they were both, huge giants of the genre. Who else do I like? Peter Mathiasson. I don't know whether you know his Shadow Country trilogy, set in Florida at the turn of the 20th century. He writes this amazing sort of three-part book about a mysterious character called Watson, who sort of drifts in and out of the story. The story is told over many years and multiple viewpoints, but it is like, I think, a quote-unquote great American novel. And it really paints an amazing picture of a lost frontier, sort of Florida, this sort of paradise, which was trapped out, shot out, burnt down, deforested, and it's become what it is today. And so I really like stories like that sort of are origin pieces in a way. It wasn't always like this, like what you see now, or even what you don't see now. It wasn't always like this. And staying in Florida, Carl Hyacin, if I got his name right,
Yes.
the comedian. Oh, I just sort of like laugh myself silly with his stuff. Cormac McCarthy, really love his stuff. And then there's an Irish writer. I'm sort of just throwing sort of free form here. Sebastian Barry. I don't know whether he's very well known in America, but he writes these beautiful lyrical novels, and one in particular that was deeply inspiring from a dark horizon called A Long, Long Way. Desperately sad story. Very easy, very quick read. But phenomenal depth of characterization in using very spare prose. I swear that guy must be channeling, a Celtic bard from sort of the mists of time. It's just amazing. And then in science fiction, William Gibson and Neil Stephenson are, I think, two of my, all-time favorites. I love their novels. William Gibson, I like to call it science fiction that's set 5 minutes into the future. So it's just spun. You can recognize the world all around you, but there's something different about it. And Neil Stephenson's novels are sort of somewhat terrifying because you read them and you know that you are tiptoeing over an abyss. There's so much you're not getting, but it's just so amazing to engage with. His novel Anathem, I don't know whether your readers will know that one, or his Baroque trilogy are some of my all-time favorites. And then maybe just end with Stephen Donaldson. He was is still a huge influence on me. The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, great fantasy epic from the 1980s, which he recently completed. I really, that's one of the series that I've reread frequently. I've gone back to Thomas Covenant a few times. and sort of read it with fresh eyes each time. And you learn something different all the time from reading these authors. Yeah, those would be a few I would toss
Yeah.
out there.
I also love that you read cross genre, because I'm a big believer that with every genre you pull in some interesting
Yeah,
aspects
absolutely.
that enriches a novel, so that you like world building, for example, and fantasy.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
can really help, and you do world building with your historical novels.
yeah,
So right, so it's basically a wonderful kind of template to work
yeah,
from and understand.
yeah.
So before we wrap up, Luke, I would really love to hear what's next for you. When's the book coming out? Are you, like you mentioned, to tell Tom that you're almost done. so, so feel
On
free
the
to share.
synopsis. From a Dark Horizon, I think was published in the US. I think last week on the 7th of December, and then the new one, the fifth one. I give it a couple of years. I think I've become a bit more sort of jaundiced about my own ability to sort of enthusiastically say to my editor and my agent, "Yeah, I'll have that done in 11 months." So I'm in a full-time job. I'm working for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Geneva,
Wow.
and I'm a reporting officer, so I look after all the big reports of UNHCR, and so it is a full-time job. It's a job that I still love, and I engage with very deeply. It doesn't give me very much brain space to sort of work around, so I have to really carve out time when I'm traveling, which in the past couple of years with COVID I haven't done much of that. And isn't it funny that how so many authors complain, if only the world would leave me alone, I would write. And lo and behold, for 2 years, the world has left us alone and we're not writing. Like, who knew? We need a bit more than that, right? So it's really weekends, holidays, Christmas is coming up. I'm really hoping to find some time to really get to grips with things. But at the moment, it's really sort of nuggets of gold and silver and a fair amount of dross. It's just all scattered around here. But what's really great about that process, I know that I've got enough bits on the board, if you like, enough about the plot structure, enough about the time, the place, the new who Reinhardt will be, and what needs to get done. That it's kind of like all that gold, all those nuggets will start to sort of melt together and sort of coalesce into something, and that's really exciting when that starts to happen, because you're on your way, and the only thing stopping you is you. So I would say, the fifth Reinhardt will be, a sequel to From a Dark Horizon, which takes place in 1918, 1919, and it'll be, Reinhardt's adventures as a very, very young cop on the rowdy streets of Weimar, Berlin, and he'll be chasing down various sundry baddies who I haven't quite identified yet, but I'm pretty sure I know who they'll be. And then, if I'm able to, and if I'm allowed to, I want to sort of really push on that idea of writing thrillers set in the aid world. Have my try and really introduce you to really interesting places and sort of really life and death situations, but also at the heart of it, it's going to be a really rip roaring thriller. Sort of page turning whodunit, but set in some of the most amazing, poor, war torn, poverty struck, desperate places on the planet. And sort of introduce you to some amazing people, and humans and all their complexity, all the way from dignity and compassion to evil and corruption and everything in between. So
that sounds good.
No stone left unturned.
Yeah, and I love it because you have the ideal platform to write this aid book as well. And I think readers would feel the authenticity seeping through the pages. And that's, I think, what we look for these days, right? We want to pick up and immerse ourselves in a world that we're not familiar with. And not only are we entertained by the book, but we're educated by the book. And I think that's the best gift you can give readers.
Yeah. I think the next Reinhardt, the fifth one, there'll be a strong, should we say, a refugee component to it. So, without giving too much away, because I haven't actually done too much to give away anyway. Berlin in the 1920s was also a city of refuge, right? So we have people from across Europe who have washed up there as refugees after World War One. So I've always wanted to try and put that part of the human experience. The human experience is very broad, but that part of a human experience where you are ill-fated to become a refugee, what that feels like, and I really wanted to push on that. So we'll have Reinhardt sort of come face to face with white Russians or Armenians or Ottomans or whatever on the streets of Berlin, and they'll be cropping up in this investigation.
Wow. I'm in. I love it. So thank you so much for joining us today, Luke. Your answers were absolutely fascinating. Like I said, so December 17th is your release date, and everyone can go out and buy, right?
That's it. December 7th. It was last week.
Okay, last week. Okay, great. So it's we can get out there and get that book and enjoy it and immerse yourself in a time past. So
That's
thanks
it.
again.
Thank you so much for having me, and good luck to all the readers who dare to pick up a Reinhardt. I wish you well.